Welcome everyone. Before we step into one of the most heartbreaking and controversial stories in American history, tell me where you're watching from today. This story took deep digging into court records, newspapers, and first-hand accounts to uncover the truth that history tried to silence. If you value real, documented stories that expose the painful realities behind America's past, make sure you subscribe now, because every detail you're about to hear comes from careful research and true historical evidence. Tonight, we're talking about Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman whose tragic choice shocked the nation and was almost erased from memory. Margaret Garner's life began in a world where freedom was not just denied, but deliberately crushed from the moment she took her first breath. Born into slavery around 1834 in Kentucky, Margaret was legally considered property, not a person, under the laws of the United States. Her childhood was shaped by forced labor, constant surveillance, and the ever-present knowledge that her body, her time, and even her future children did not belong to her. Like many enslaved girls, Margaret learned early that survival depended on silence, obedience, and endurance, but also that none of these could truly protect her. From a young age, Margaret was forced into domestic work, which placed her inside the enslaver's household rather than the fields. While some later romanticized domestic slavery as easier, the reality was often more brutal. Domestic enslaved women were under constant watch and had little protection from abuse. For Margaret, this meant growing up in close proximity to white men who had complete power over her body. Historical records strongly suggest that Margaret was repeatedly sexually abused by her enslaver, a common but rarely acknowledged reality of slavery. The children she later gave birth to were light-skinned, a silent testimony to the violence enslaved women endured and were expected never to speak of. Margaret lived with the constant terror that defined enslaved motherhood. Under slavery, children were not blessings protected by love. They were assets that could be sold, traded, or used to punish their parents. An enslaved mother could raise a child for years, only to watch them be taken away without warning. Margaret saw this happen to other women. She heard the screams, saw the empty cabins, and witnessed the grief that never truly healed. Every pregnancy brought fear instead of hope. Every birth was shadowed by the question, how long before this child is taken from me? By the time Margaret became a mother herself, she understood the full horror of her situation. She knew that her children would inherit her status as property. She knew they would grow up under the same violence, the same humiliation, and the same constant threat of sale. For a woman like Margaret, there was no illusion that obedience would bring safety. Slavery offered no mercy for loyalty and no reward for suffering in silence. It only promised more loss. Margaret's life was also shaped by the growing tension in America during the 1840s and 1850s. The country was increasingly divided over slavery, and enslaved people were painfully aware of these debates, even if history often pretends they were not. Stories of escape, abolitionist whispers, and rumors of freedom across the Ohio River reached plantations like dangerous sparks of hope. Margaret lived just miles from free states, close enough to imagine freedom, yet trapped by laws designed to hunt her down if she dared reach for it. Despite the crushing weight of her circumstances, Margaret was not passive. Those who knew her described her as quiet but determined, observant, and deeply protective of her children. She carried herself with a strength that unsettled those who believed enslaved people should be submissive. Her love for her children was fierce, shaped not only by affection but by fear. She did not dream of a better life for herself alone. She dreamed of a future where her children would never be owned, violated, or sold. Every day Margaret lived with an impossible contradiction. She was expected to nurture children in a system designed to destroy families. She was expected to be a mother without being allowed to protect. Over time, that contradiction hardened into something unbreakable inside her. The world around her tried to strip her of humanity, but it could not erase her instincts as a mother or her awareness of what awaited her children if she failed to act. This is the truth that often gets buried beneath sensational headlines and moral debates. Margaret Garner was not driven by madness or cruelty. She was shaped by a system so violent and dehumanizing that it forced enslaved mothers to confront choices no human being should ever face. Her life before the tragedy was not calm or ordinary. It was a slow, relentless build-up of fear, trauma, and desperation. Every abuse she endured, every child she watched torn from another mother's arms, every night she lay awake listening for footsteps outside her cabin, pushed her closer to the edge. Understanding Margaret Garner's life under slavery is essential, because her later actions did not come from a single moment of panic. They were the result of years of suffering in a system that left her no safe choices. Her story begins not with tragedy, but with survival. Survival in a world that gave her every reason to believe that death might be kinder than life in chains. The escape that Margaret Garner attempted was not sudden or reckless. It was the result of years of fear, whispered planning, and the growing certainty that remaining enslaved meant condemning her children to lives of suffering she could no longer bear to imagine. By the winter of 1856, Margaret and her husband Robert understood that time was running out. Rumors circulated that enslaved people on nearby plantations were being sold south, where conditions were known to be even more brutal. For Margaret, the thought of her children being dragged deeper into slavery, away from any hope of freedom, was unbearable. The Ohio River lay only a short distance away, a narrow stretch of water that separated bondage from freedom, and in her mind it became both a promise and a final chance. The escape was carefully timed. Winter was dangerous, but it also offered cover. Snow muffled footsteps. Darkness came early. Slave catchers were less likely to patrol aggressively in bitter cold. Margaret, heavily pregnant at the time, gathered her 4 children and prepared for a journey she knew might kill them all. Yet even that risk felt preferable to staying. This was not just an escape for herself. It was a desperate act of maternal protection. She understood the Fugitive Slave Act meant that even if they reached a free state, they would not truly be safe. Still, freedom, even briefly, was worth everything. On the night of January 27, 1856, Margaret, Robert, their children, and several other enslaved relatives slipped away from their plantation in Kentucky. They traveled on foot, moving silently through freezing conditions. Margaret carried one child while guiding the others, her body exhausted but her resolve unbroken. Every sound in the darkness, cracking branches, distant voices, felt like a death sentence. The group crossed the frozen Ohio River, a perilous act in itself, knowing the ice could give way at any moment. When they finally reached Cincinnati, Ohio, they believed, for a fleeting moment, that they had succeeded. They sought refuge in the home of 3 black relatives, crowded into a small house that offered warmth but little security. Margaret knew that slave catchers would come. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed enslavers to cross into free states and forcibly reclaim people who had escaped. Federal law was on the side of those who hunted her. Even in freedom, she was not safe. She barely slept, listening for footsteps, for knocking at the door, for the sound of men coming to drag her children back into chains. That sound came quickly. Within hours, slave catchers and U.S. Marshals surrounded the house. They battered down the door, chaos erupting inside the cramped space. Margaret saw the men closing in, heard her children crying, and felt the certainty that this was the moment she had feared most. She knew what awaited her children if they were taken back: lifetimes of forced labor, abuse, and separation. She had lived it. She had survived sexual violence, constant humiliation, and the absolute erasure of her autonomy. She could not allow that future for her children. In that moment of capture, Margaret made a decision that would shock the nation and haunt American history. But it's important to understand that this decision was not born in that room. It was forged long before, through years of witnessing what slavery did to families. Her escape was not only physical, it was psychological. It was a rejection of a system that denied her the right to be a mother in any meaningful sense. Every step she took toward the river was driven by the belief that freedom was worth any cost. The tragedy that followed often overshadows the escape itself, but the escape tells us who Margaret was. She was not passive. She was not unaware. She was a woman who understood the full reality of slavery and acted with intention. Escaping while pregnant, in winter, with small children, was an act of extraordinary courage. It required planning, trust, and an unbreakable will. She risked death, not because she didn't value life, but because she valued her children's humanity more than her own safety. The escape also exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of American law. Margaret crossed into a free state believing, as many did, that freedom meant protection. Instead, she learned that the law prioritized property over people, even in states that claimed to oppose slavery. Her capture showed that slavery's reach did not end at state borders. It followed enslaved people wherever they went, turning even acts of hope into moments of terror. Margaret's escape attempt became one of the most famous in American history, not because it failed, but because it revealed the impossible choices enslaved mothers were forced to confront. She did not run blindly. She ran knowing exactly what was at stake. The escape was her final stand against a system that had already taken so much from her. It was an act of resistance fueled by love, fear, and an unshakable refusal to surrender her children to a life she knew too well. To understand Margaret Garner's escape is to understand the depth of desperation slavery created. This was not a story of recklessness. It was a story of a mother who believed that freedom, even for a moment, was worth the ultimate risk, and that belief would soon place her at the center of one of the most painful moral reckonings America has ever faced. The moment of capture was the exact nightmare Margaret Garner had been running from, and when it finally arrived, it came with brutal speed and no mercy. The house in Cincinnati that had offered a brief illusion of safety was suddenly surrounded by U.S. Marshals and slave catchers acting under the authority of the Fugitive Slave Act. These were not strangers operating in secret. They were representatives of the law itself, men empowered by the federal government to drag human beings back into bondage. Margaret heard the pounding at the door, the shouts, the chaos erupting outside, and in that instant, every fear she had carried for years crystallized into certainty. There would be no rescue. There would be no second escape. As the door was forced open, panic filled the cramped house. Children cried. Adults shouted. The small space became unbearable with fear. Margaret saw the men moving room to room, grabbing at bodies, asserting ownership over people who had tasted freedom for only a few hours. She understood immediately what capture meant. It was not simply a return to slavery, it was punishment. Enslaved people who escaped were often beaten, sold away from family, or sent further south where survival was even less likely. For her children, capture meant lives of forced labor, violence, and the same sexual exploitation that had already shaped her own existence. Margaret did not have the luxury of time or distance to think. There was no calm reflection, no debate. What she faced was an impossible choice created entirely by the institution of slavery itself. If her children were taken, their lives would belong to others. They would grow up owned, controlled, and vulnerable in ways she knew too well. If she acted, the consequences would be immediate and irreversible. There was no outcome that spared her from devastation. Slavery had already stripped away every human option. In that moment, Margaret made the decision that history would struggle to comprehend. Her action was not driven by rage or cruelty, but by a fierce, desperate conviction that death was preferable to a lifetime of enslavement. This belief was not uncommon among enslaved mothers, though few were ever forced into circumstances where it became visible to the public. Margaret had seen what slavery did to children. She had lived it. She believed, with everything she was, that she was saving her child from a fate worse than death. The tragedy unfolded quickly, amid screaming and chaos, before the men could fully stop her. When they did, Margaret did not resist further. Witnesses later described her as calm, almost eerily so, as if the decision, once made, had drained every ounce of fear from her body. She reportedly stated that she would rather see her child dead than return to slavery. Those words shocked a nation, not because they were incomprehensible, but because they forced Americans to confront what slavery truly meant when stripped of euphemisms and excuses. Margaret was arrested immediately, not initially for what she had done, but as fugitive property. That fact alone revealed the moral corruption of the system. The law was less concerned with the loss of a child's life than with the loss of an enslaver's property. Court proceedings quickly turned into a national spectacle. Newspapers across the country seized on the story, framing Margaret alternately as a monster or as a tragic figure driven beyond endurance. Abolitionists saw her as living proof of slavery's cruelty. Pro-slavery voices condemned her as evidence of supposed moral inferiority. Very few asked the most important question: what kind of system forces a mother into such a choice? Margaret herself remained largely silent during the legal battle that followed. She did not beg for forgiveness. She did not deny what she had done. Her silence spoke volumes. She knew that no court, no jury, and no law could truly judge her fairly, because none of them had lived the life she had lived. None of them had been owned. None of them had carried children knowing those children could be taken, sold, or abused at any moment. The moment of capture and Margaret's decision shattered the comfortable distance many Americans maintained from slavery's realities. This was not a story happening on a distant plantation. It unfolded in a free state, under federal law, in front of witnesses who could not look away. It exposed the lie that slavery was a benign institution and revealed it as a system so violent that it pushed a mother beyond the boundaries of human endurance. What made Margaret's choice so disturbing to the public was not the act itself, but what it implied. If an enslaved mother believed death was preferable to slavery, then slavery itself had to be worse than most people were willing to admit. That realization terrified those who defended the institution. It threatened to collapse the moral framework that allowed slavery to continue. Margaret's decision was never meant to be symbolic. It was intensely personal, born out of love twisted by terror. Yet it became symbolic anyway, because it forced America to confront the cost of its laws. Her story challenged the nation to ask whether freedom could truly exist alongside a system that treated human beings as property. The capture marked the end of Margaret's escape, but it also marked the beginning of her place in history. From that moment forward, her life was no longer her own story alone. It became a mirror held up to America, reflecting a truth many wanted desperately to bury. And no matter how hard they tried, the image could not be erased. The death of Margaret Garner's child was the heart of the tragedy, and the moment that captured the attention of an entire nation. In the chaos of capture, with slave catchers and marshals surrounding her, Margaret faced an impossible decision: allow her child to be returned to slavery, subjected to a lifetime of labor, abuse, and dehumanization, or take a drastic step that would ensure the child never lived under the oppressive system that had shaped her own existence. The act itself, tragic and horrifying, was the ultimate expression of a mother's desperation in a world where she had no power to protect her children within the confines of the law. Accounts from the night describe a scene of frenzied terror. Margaret, holding her child close, was confronted by armed men intent on reclaiming what they legally considered property. She understood fully that compliance would mean her child's life would be a continual inheritance of pain and bondage. It was not a rash decision. It was a deliberate act born from years of witnessing the cruelty and degradation of slavery. She knew the law would treat her actions as criminal, but in her mind, it was a moral imperative. To her, death was preferable to the suffering the child would endure. The death itself was brief, but searing in its impact. Witnesses later recounted the shock and disbelief that followed. The household, which had moments before been filled with the sounds of fear and struggle, fell into a stunned silence. The child's cry, so intimately tied to its existence, and yet so impossibly linked to danger, ended in an instant, leaving an echo that seemed to reverberate in the minds of all present. It was the cry of life extinguished by an act of love turned desperate, a sound that imprinted itself on everyone who heard it. Public reaction to the event was immediate and polarized. Newspapers across the country ran sensationalized accounts, framing Margaret as either a monstrous figure or a tragic heroine forced to act under unconscionable conditions. Abolitionist publications highlighted her story as evidence of the inherent brutality of slavery, showing that it pushed even the most loving mothers to the edge of unimaginable choices. Pro-slavery papers condemned her as immoral, using the incident to argue that enslaved people were dangerous, incapable of moral judgment, and unfit for freedom. Few voices recognized the unbearable circumstances that drove her to such an act. Margaret's child's death also ignited a legal and moral debate that exposed the contradictions and cruelty of the United States laws at the time. The Fugitive Slave Act dictated that escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners. Yet this law forced mothers like Margaret to choose between the law and their children's humanity. Courts were confronted with questions that had no satisfactory answers. How do you judge a parent who acts to prevent a life of enslavement? How do you assign criminality to someone whose moral framework has been shaped entirely by a system that denies basic human rights? These questions went largely unanswered, leaving the nation to wrestle with the psychological and ethical ramifications of slavery in stark, undeniable terms. Beyond the courtroom, the death had profound psychological effects on Margaret herself. Historical accounts suggest she was deeply affected by the act, experiencing profound grief, guilt, and trauma, even as she rationalized it as necessary to protect her children. The weight of her decision did not lessen over time. It became a defining element of her life, the event by which she was known publicly, and the lens through which her story would be interpreted by generations. The complexity of her emotions, love, desperation, and moral resolve offers insight into the human cost of slavery that statistics and economic accounts can never fully convey. This moment also transformed the national consciousness about slavery. Margaret Garner's act forced the American public to confront the human consequences of an institution often discussed in abstract political or economic terms. It was no longer theoretical. It was a visceral, horrifying reality experienced by a mother who had loved her children fiercely and fully, even within the brutal confines of bondage. The act became a symbol, whether one wanted to recognize it as such or not, of the moral bankruptcy of slavery and the impossible choices forced upon enslaved people. Ultimately, the child's death was both a personal and political tragedy. For Margaret, it was a devastating decision to protect her children from a life of suffering. For the nation, it was a mirror reflecting the cruelty and inhumanity of a system that treated human beings as property and forced mothers to consider whether life itself could be worse than death. The cry that marked that child's passing became emblematic of the countless, untold tragedies endured by enslaved families, echoing far beyond the walls of the house where it occurred, resonating in history as a haunting reminder of the moral cost of slavery. Margaret's child's death also cemented her place in history, not as a mere footnote, but as a figure whose life and choices challenge modern audiences to grapple with the extremity of human suffering under slavery. It underscores a central truth, that the cruelties of slavery were not only physical but moral and psychological, shaping decisions in ways that still shock and compel us to consider what it truly meant to live, love, and survive in a world designed to strip both. The courtroom battle that followed Margaret Garner's tragic act became one of the most infamous legal and moral conflicts in antebellum America, drawing national attention and exposing the deep divisions in the country over slavery. Almost immediately after her capture, Margaret and her husband Robert were detained under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a federal law that required the return of escaped enslaved people even from free states. The law treated them as property, not as human beings, and it left little room for consideration of the moral or personal circumstances that had led Margaret to her desperate act. From the moment she was arrested, The legal system framed the case as one of ownership, obedience, and property rights, rather than as the profoundly human tragedy it truly was. The case quickly escalated beyond the local courts in Cincinnati. Newspapers from both the North and South seized upon it, transforming it into a spectacle of morality, legality, and ideology. Abolitionist presses used Margaret's story to highlight the inhumanity of slavery, emphasizing that it could drive a mother to such a horrifying choice. They portrayed her as a woman caught in a system that valued property over life, forcing readers to confront the ethical bankruptcy of laws that treated humans as possessions. Meanwhile, pro-slavery publications decried her as criminal and immoral, arguing that her actions were proof that enslaved people were incapable of moral judgment and needed strict control. The case became a proxy for the national debate over slavery itself, with Margaret's fate symbolizing the larger struggle between freedom and bondage, humanity and property, North and South. The legal arguments were complex and fraught with tension. Her defense, largely supported by abolitionist lawyers and sympathizers, tried to frame her act as one of necessity, an extreme response to an impossible situation. They argued that Margaret's maternal instincts and her desire to protect her children from the brutal realities of slavery justified her actions. The prosecution, representing the enslaver's interests, countered that the law could not tolerate such behavior. Under property law, Margaret had no right to make any decision concerning her children that contradicted their status as enslaved property. The courtroom became a theater of moral and legal conflict, with each argument reflecting the deep societal divide over slavery. As the trial progressed, Margaret herself remained largely silent, a presence that conveyed both defiance and resignation. Her silence spoke volumes to those who could read it. It was as if she were asserting that words could not capture the depth of her experience under slavery or justify the system that had driven her to such a desperate choice. Her lawyers had to argue on her behalf, presenting the moral and emotional context that the law deliberately ignored. They emphasized that her actions were not born from malice, but from a profound awareness of the consequences that awaited her children if returned to bondage. The case also highlighted the limitations of the legal system when confronted with slavery's moral complexities. Judges and juries could only apply laws that recognized ownership and property rights, not the human suffering those laws created. No matter how compelling the moral arguments were, the law could not fully account for Margaret's humanity, her pain, or the coercive pressures under which she acted. Her trial demonstrated the tension between legal authority and ethical responsibility, and it revealed the deep hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to value justice while allowing slavery to operate unchecked. Public reaction to the courtroom proceedings intensified the pressure. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, newspapers printed sensationalized accounts, and politicians used the case to advance their positions on slavery. The trial became not just about Margaret Garner and her children, but about the morality of slavery itself. Northern abolitionists saw her as a symbol of the moral crisis inherent in treating human beings as property, while Southern pro-slavery advocates used the case to warn enslaved populations of the consequences of resistance. It was a legal drama that transcended the courtroom, influencing public opinion and feeding the growing sectional tensions that would culminate in the Civil War. Ultimately, The trial underscored the impossibility of justice under slavery. Margaret's act was morally and emotionally understandable, yet legally punishable. The law could enforce punishment, but could not reconcile the human suffering that led to it. It forced the nation to confront a bitter truth. Slavery corrupted both morality and law, creating situations where the most natural and loving instincts, a mother's desire to protect her children, were treated as crimes. The courtroom battle also had a lasting impact on American history and collective memory. It became a powerful story in abolitionist literature, highlighting the extreme human costs of slavery and inspiring empathy and outrage. It forced lawmakers, citizens, and historians to acknowledge the psychological and emotional trauma imposed on enslaved families. Margaret's trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a moral reckoning that exposed the brutal consequences of a system that treated people as property and motherhood as irrelevant to the law. In the end, the courtroom became a mirror reflecting the nation's deepest contradictions. Margaret Garner was judged according to laws that valued property over life. Yet her story resonated far beyond the legal definitions of right and wrong. It remains a chilling testament to the cruelty of slavery and the impossible moral dilemmas it imposed, proving that the law could punish her, but could never fully judge the human heart and mind forced to act under its oppression. The way newspapers, politicians, and abolitionists reshaped Margaret Garner's story played a critical role in how her tragic choice was remembered and interpreted by the American public, both then and for generations afterward. Almost immediately after the events unfolded in Cincinnati, journalists descended on the case, recognizing that it was not just a local incident, but a story with national resonance. Northern newspapers framed Margaret as a symbol of the cruelty of slavery, emphasizing her desperate act as proof that the system itself was inherently violent and inhumane. The details of her life, her escape, and the horrifying decision she made were recounted in vivid, often sensationalized terms, designed to evoke outrage and sympathy. Through this coverage, Margaret Garner became more than an individual. She became a representation of the countless enslaved people whose suffering was largely invisible to the broader public. Abolitionists seized on the story as a rallying point. They published pamphlets and articles highlighting Margaret's courage and maternal instinct, portraying her decision as an act of defiance against a system that denied her children freedom and dignity. Speeches were made, letters were circulated, and the case became a key example of the moral bankruptcy of slavery in activist circles. Abolitionist writers stressed that Margaret's choice, while tragic, was a natural consequence of an institution that treated human beings as property, and they urged readers to confront the ethical implications of tolerating such a system. Her story was not just news. It became a tool for social and political advocacy, illustrating the lengths to which enslaved people would go to reclaim agency in a world that denied them humanity. Meanwhile, pro-slavery newspapers and politicians sought to reinterpret the events in a way that justified their own positions. They condemned Margaret as a monstrous figure, using her act to argue that enslaved people were inherently dangerous, irrational, and incapable of moral reasoning. This narrative supported the notion that slavery was necessary to control a population deemed morally unfit for freedom. Southern politicians referenced the case in speeches and legislative debates, framing it as evidence that any challenge to slavery could result in chaos and bloodshed. In this way, Margaret's personal tragedy was opted to serve broader ideological purposes, reinforcing pro-slavery arguments and stoking fear among white populations. The polarization of public opinion around her story further complicated the historical record. Depending on the source, Margaret Garner was depicted either as a heroic, if tragic, figure, or as a criminal who had committed an unthinkable act. This duality created a narrative tension that persists to this day. One side emphasized her victimhood and bravery, while the other focused on the horror of her act, often ignoring the systemic forces that led to it. Both perspectives, in their own way, reshaped the perception of the events, turning a single human tragedy into a symbol for larger societal debates about race, law, and morality. Politicians also used her story strategically during a period of intense national division over slavery. Northern lawmakers highlighted Margaret's case as evidence that slavery corrupted not only the enslaved, but the moral fabric of the entire nation. Southern lawmakers, conversely, cited her actions to argue for stricter enforcement of fugitive slave laws and harsher control over enslaved populations. In effect, Margaret became a pawn in the political battle over the future of the country, her personal suffering leveraged to advance partisan agendas. Even decades later, the retelling of Margaret Garner's story continued to evolve. Writers, historians, and journalists revisited the case, sometimes adding context, sometimes reshaping it to fit contemporary narratives about slavery, race, and resistance. Abolitionist interpretations emphasized moral courage and maternal devotion, while other retellings highlighted legal and ethical dilemmas, framing her as a cautionary figure. These repeated reinterpretations show how Margaret's story was continually molded to fit the social and political needs of the time, often obscuring the raw human experience at the center of it all. The reshaping of her story had profound cultural consequences. Margaret Garner became emblematic not only of the suffering imposed by slavery, but also of the ways in which narratives about enslaved people could be manipulated to serve moral, political, and ideological purposes. Her life, her choices, and her suffering were filtered through the lenses of journalists, politicians, and activists, each emphasizing different aspects to serve their own ends. In doing so, they ensured that her story would endure far beyond her lifetime, even as the personal reality behind it risked being lost. Ultimately, the way Margaret Garner's story was framed by newspapers, politicians, and abolitionists highlights the complex interplay between lived experience and public memory. While her act was intensely personal and rooted in unimaginable circumstances, the narratives constructed around it transformed her into a symbol of broader social, political, and moral struggles. Her life became a lens through which Americans confronted the injustices of slavery, debated the ethics of motherhood under bondage, and wrestled with the nation's conscience. The reshaping of her story ensured that Margaret Garner would not simply be remembered as a mother forced to make a tragic choice, but as an enduring symbol of the profound human cost of slavery and the moral reckonings it demanded. The story of Margaret Garner's life and tragic choice was deliberately obscured and suppressed in many ways, reflecting a broader societal desire to bury the uncomfortable truths about slavery in America. Even as newspapers sensationalized her case, much of the personal, intimate reality of her experience was lost or intentionally left out of public discourse. Those in positions of power, lawmakers, slaveholders, and even some media outlets, had a vested interest in controlling the narrative, portraying her either as a criminal or a cautionary tale, rather than a human being who had suffered under a system designed to strip away her autonomy. This selective memory ensured that the deeper moral and psychological implications of her actions were largely ignored, creating a sanitized version of history that made the public more comfortable with the institution of slavery. Margaret's story was further buried by the ways in which legal and social systems treated enslaved people as property rather than individuals. Court documents, which might have revealed the full depth of her fear, her reasoning, and her suffering, often emphasized technicalities of law over human experience. To the authorities, Margaret was not a mother faced with an impossible choice. She was a fugitive and a criminal whose personal motivations were irrelevant. By reducing her story to legal jargon and procedural details, the system effectively erased her humanity from the historical record. Her voice, her grief, and her moral reasoning were largely absent from the documents that survived, leaving later generations to piece together the truth from fragments and secondary accounts. Additionally, public discomfort with the moral implications of her act contributed to the erasure of her full story. In the 19th century, Americans struggled to reconcile the image of a mother who killed her own child with their notions of morality and propriety. Rather than confront the fact that slavery itself created conditions in which such acts could seem rational or even necessary, many preferred to cast Margaret as an aberration, an extreme case that could be dismissed rather than examined. This moral discomfort encouraged a collective amnesia about the daily horrors faced by enslaved mothers, and her story became a disturbing footnote rather than a central lesson in the brutality of the institution. Even abolitionist accounts, while sympathetic, sometimes unintentionally contributed to the erasure of her personal voice. They highlighted her act as proof of slavery's cruelty, framing her story as a tool for moral and political advocacy, rather than as a nuanced human experience. In focusing on the symbolic value of her tragedy, they emphasized the outrage and the injustice of the system, but often overlooked the intimate details of her life, the terror she endured, and the complex emotions she wrestled with in that moment. While this helped galvanize anti-slavery sentiment, it also shaped a narrative that, in many ways, sanitized her lived reality and obscured the personal dimensions of her suffering. Over time, this combination of legal framing, public discomfort, and selective storytelling allowed the truth of Margaret Garner's experience to fade from popular memory. The events that unfolded in Cincinnati, which should have been recognized as a profound moral and ethical crisis, became instead a story told through the lenses of sensationalism, politics, and ideology. Her life and actions were interpreted as symbols, cautionary tales, or moral lessons, rather than fully acknowledged as the tragic consequence of an oppressive system that forced a mother to confront a choice no human should ever face. The erasure of Margaret Garner's story also reflects a broader pattern in American history, where the voices of enslaved people, particularly women, were systematically silenced. Their experiences, decisions, and reasoning were often left out of records, leaving only fragments for historians to reconstruct. Margaret's narrative illustrates how the personal stories of those who suffered most under slavery were vulnerable to distortion, omission, or outright suppression. In her case, the urgency and terror of her actions were overshadowed by debates about law, property, and morality, leaving a version of history that minimized her agency and her humanity. Yet, despite this deliberate forgetting, Margaret Garner's story could not be entirely buried. Over time, historians, writers, and activists have worked to recover the truth of her life and actions, piecing together the fragments left in court records, newspaper articles, and oral histories. By doing so, they have restored her voice to some degree, allowing modern audiences to understand the unimaginable pressures and moral dilemmas she faced. Her story endures as a powerful reminder that history is not only written by those in power, but can be reclaimed through careful research, empathy, and a commitment to uncovering silenced truths. Ultimately, the deliberate burial of Margaret Garner's story underscores the lengths to which society will go to avoid confronting its own complicity in oppression. Her tragedy was inconvenient, her moral reasoning uncomfortable, and her humanity undeniable. Yet, by restoring her narrative, we are forced to acknowledge not only the horrors of slavery, but also the resilience, love, and profound moral courage of the mother who, in a moment of impossible choice, acted to protect her children in the only way she could. Her story reminds us that the truths of history are often messy, painful, and deliberately obscured, but they must be uncovered and remembered if we are to fully understand the human cost of systemic oppression.